Welcome, everyone, to a special short edition of Philosophy Bakes Bread, which we call a breadcrumb.
That's crumbling bread. It's going crumble, 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 crumble. Philosophy Bakes Bread is a production of the Society of Philosophers in America. In our breadcrumb episodes, we include snippets from past episodes or more substantive responses to your feedback that we have received on Twitter, where you can reach us at PhilosophyBB, Facebook at Philosophy Bakes Bread, or by email at philosophybakesbread@gmail.com.
That's right. Today we've got another fun breadcrumb episode for you with Dr. Marilyn Fischer, and this one is titled Adams and Dewey.
Welcome back, Marilyn. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
A quick reminder for our listeners that Dr. Marilyn Fischer is Professor Emerita at the University of Dayton, and she specializes in political philosophy and American Pragmatism. Marilyn was our guest in episode 67 of the show, Jane Addams and Democratic Activism. And today we're going to have a response to a question we received about this episode.
Yeah, actually, that episode number 67 was about Jane Addams and her democratic activism. And we have talked about one of the people with whom she did some work a number of times on the show, and that's John Dewey. And actually, this question doesn't come from outside the show. It comes from me because I was wondering whether we could ask Marilyn just to say a little bit about the relationship between Jane Addams and John Dewey. John Dewey talked a lot about publicly engaged, philosophical thinking, but really Jane Addams walked the walk. And I think she was an important inspiration for him. Maybe Marilyn, the idea was just to invite you to say whatever you have to tell us about kind of that relationship between the two of them. And I thought that'd be fun, see that These people were people,
Eric,
Yes.
Is this you abusing your power to get Marilyn
it might be
to answer
abuse.
questions?
I hope
It's
it's
an
not
excellent
abuse.
question. No,
It's
it's
a
an
good
excellent question. The traditional way of looking at the relationship between Dewey and Adams historically has been Dewey was the philosopher, Adams was the activist. She did what Dewey philosophized. And we're now finding that is just not accurate. Now, let me first talk about personal interactions between them, and then I'll talk a little bit about intellectual influences. Now, Adams again founded Hull House in 1889. 5 years later, Dewey moved to Chicago, 1894, and he lived there for 10 years. Now, Adams and Dewey had known each other before that when he was teaching in Michigan, but they really became very good friends in Chicago. There were lots of interactions between them. Dewey came to Hull House often, sometimes to visit, sometimes to speak. He gave a number of talks there. He was a member of the Board of Trustees, and as one person commented, unlike a lot of board members, he actually worked at the job.
Oh, wow.
So he was there a lot. Now, when he first arrived, it was in the middle of the strike of the Pullman workers. It was a very vicious, brutal strike. And he talked
which
to
was
Adams.
about trains, right?
Yeah. And he talked to Adams, and her response completely blew him away. And so he commented that her analysis of that was the most profound philosophy he had seen in a very long time.
Aha.
Wow.
They were such good friends that Dewey named one of his daughters after Adams, his daughter Jane Dewey.
I never thought about that.
Yeah. And
Interesting.
Yeah, I didn't put that together. It seems obvious now.
Dewey's son Gordon died as a young boy in 1904, and Adams gave a very moving eulogy at his funeral. So there were very close associations between them.
Marilyn, in just at least very broad brushstrokes for the listeners who don't know, what were the Pullman strikes about, very roughly?
The Pullman strike was George Pullman, who was the head of the Pullman Car Company, railroad cars, had built a company town. It was a town with nice brick homes, a theater, a church, many other facilities for his workers. But he told the workers they were not allowed to unionize. Then a recession hit. He cut wages drastically by a third. He fired a lot of people. But he did not cut rents. He did not cut prices at the company store. So they went ahead and went on strike anyway. And eventually, Adams, in fact, tried to negotiate the strike. She was on the Citizens Committee that went back and forth between the workers and Pullman. Pullman refused to negotiate. There's nothing to negotiate, he says. Eventually, the National Guard were called in, and they put down the strike quite violently.
Yeah,
the workers
a lot of workers were killed, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
A lot of death.
Right. Mm-hmm. Very, very helpful. And this made an impression on Dewey as he was coming to town,
yes.
Right, at the time.
Yes.
Yeah. Very, very helpful. Thank you so much for that, Marilyn.
Now, there are big projects in Chicago, most seen, were Dewey's so-called laboratory school, which was his vision of what a school should be. It's still going on in Chicago today. And a few years later, Adams opened the Hull House Labor Museum, which was just what
the Hull House what?
Labor Museum, which was a museum about the history of labor. She said, we have plenty of museums about wars and kings. Let's have one about what ordinary people have been doing all their lives.
Fascinating.
Now, in setting up both of these institutions, there was a lot of interaction between the people involved in each one. So if you look at Dewey and Adams not as Dewey and Adams individuals, but as their circle of endeavor, including the faculty at the laboratory school, the people who worked there, the people who worked on the Labor Museum, collected artifacts, envisioned how it should be set up. Some of the teachers who worked at the laboratory school actually lived at Hull House. And so there was lots of back and forth on that level. Dewey, in explaining his laboratory school, said at one point that the Labor Museum was the model of an ideal school. So he thought what she was doing in terms of her educational endeavors was just right on the point.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, in 1904, Dewey moved out of Chicago.
Let me follow up on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
What was she doing that made such an impression? Well, what was it doing that was right?
What Adams wanted to do was to show the factory workers, again, mostly immigrants, in Chicago, that what they did mattered, that it had a history. And so she showed, for example, the history of copper mining and what copper was used for from way back. And the exhibits ended up, you could go to the local Western Electric factory and see copper being used. The same thing with textile production, the same thing with all kinds of metalwork and other kinds of hand skills. The other things that's interesting about the museum is the immigrants from the neighborhood did function as docents, as teachers. Many of the immigrant women had old-fashioned handcrafts kinds of work that they did, embroidery work, spinning, weaving, and so on. And they would give classes in that. And then they would sell their goods in the museum store. So what it did was it relocated the immigrants in relationship to the middle-class visitors who came through. Instead of being lower class, not worthy, they all at once were people with expertise. So that was the basic idea behind the Labor Museum.
Well, this sounds like a very big influence on Dewey when I think about the ways in which he came to think about art and about things that should be in museums. He wanted to make sure we didn't just think about art as high culture in the sense of the stuff that only wealthy patrons could support and fund, right? He wanted people to see art everywhere, and so this is something like the point about making sure our museums aren't just for the inaccessible things of the wealthy. Yes,
excellent point. And that was the Labor Museum. And so there was lots of art at the Labor Museum. There were labor songs, music about workers. There was all kinds of art representing labor historically and today. So it was an all-around sensory and intellectual experience.
Fascinating. And clearly that sounds like at least, mutually supportive with Dewey, but it sounds more like it was pretty inspirational and influential on him.
Yes. Now, Dewey had his laboratory school been going for 3 years, and Adams made the comment, there was no one here that there's nowhere that factory parents and their children can get an education that applies to them. And so the laboratory school wasn't doing it. It was very much a small experiment. She wanted something on a much grander scale, exactly right for the populations in Chicago that were ignored by the school systems.
I see.
Very nice points. Are there any other final thoughts you want to add about the relationship between Dewey and Adams?
After 1904, Dewey moved to New York City. And after that time, there's very little correspondence between them, so it's hard to know. Adams was often in New York City. Whether they saw each other during those occasions, I don't know. And what connection there was, I don't know. Now, in terms of intellectual influences, I think the best answer is there was a lot of interaction going both ways. Many parallels in their thoughts about democracy, but it's really hard to tell who thought what when that influenced who. Adams actually quotes Dewey, not super often, but occasionally throughout her lifetime. Now, a couple of interesting points. Charlene Haddock-Siegfried, who is a leading Adams scholar today, as well as one of the leading scholars of pragmatism today, did a fascinating study a few years ago where she compared Adams' first book, Democracy and Social Ethics, published in 1902, with lecture notes of Dewey's from when he taught the book to his classes. And what she said was, at this point, Dewey didn't get it. He didn't get what Adams was doing. He was still working his way out of Hegelianism, while Adams was the full-fledged pragmatist. So
Can you maybe say a quick word what Hegelianism and pragmatism is, kind of very quickly, right here for our listeners?
Hegelianism is the notion that this abstract idea of spirit is moving through history. And so improvements intellectually and socially and so on have to do with this movement of the rational spirit. It's not based on what's happening on the ground at all. While pragmatists look at, well, let's say they look at a situation much like an ecological habitat. It's full of organisms that are all interacting with each other. And so what happens depends on this interaction back and forth. And so that's the guiding image for pragmatists.
Perhaps one further difference is that Hegelianism thinks about kind of history as a matter of progress, right? Whereas pragmatists think progress is possible, but sure isn't inevitable.
Right.
Is that a fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. All right. Very, very nice. This is super helpful,
Now,
Marilyn.
Now, I've studied one of Adams' very early essays from 1895. That's 7 years before Democracy and Social Ethics, called A Function of the Settlement in the Labor Movement. Now, people talk about Dewey's ethics as having a pragmatist ethics, where instead of starting with abstract ethical principles, he begins with a morally troubling situation and then tries to figure out what kinds of ethical concerns emerge from the situation. What can we do to refine our thinking within the situation to try to make things better? Not that we're going to solve things with the right answer, but to make things better. And what I found in her 1895 analysis of how settlement should respond to labor unrest was, in dealing with a specific incident, a full-blown pragmatist ethical analysis. It was just what Dewey came up with 13 years later in his book that's titled Ethics. Now, at this point, Dewey was even more of a Hegelian than he was in 1892.
Right.
So what's going on here? We know that they saw each other. We know they talked. And Dewey was probably paying attention. How is she doing this? Even though Adams and Dewey were born at about the same time, most of Adams' major writing was before or immediately around the time of World War I. Most of Dewey's major works were after that. And so he was responding to a very different country, a very different political and social situation than she was. And I think that disjunct, he lived a very long time, much longer than she did. And I think that disjunct also makes them seem a little more distant.
Oh, that's a good point too, and that follows kind of with that distinction we were making between Hegelianism and pragmatism, right?
Yeah.
So if you're taking the situation seriously, then yes, of course he'll respond slightly differently to everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting. That's a good point. Yeah, I remember learning that the majority of Dewey's books were written actually after he retired.
Oh my!
If I'm not mistaken, I think it was after he retired from Columbia. If you look at his corpus, I'm going to check myself on that, and I'll put something in the show notes if I'm wrong. But I believe he wrote the majority of his books after he retired.
Yeah. That could well be.
Thank you so much, Marilyn.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Happy to do it. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed this little breadcrumb. I know I've kind of learned quite a bit.
I did too.
Yeah.
So remember, everyone, that you can call us and leave us a short recorded message with a question or a comment that we may be able to play on the show at 859-257-1849. And you can also reach us on Twitter, Facebook, or by email. For any of that information, again, visit philosophybakesbread.com.
This has been Anthony Cashio and Eric Weber speaking today with Dr. Marilyn Fischer. Thanks again, Marilyn. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you.
And this has been Philosophy Bakes Bread. Food for thought about life and leadership.